is still a profoundly moving statement of our values. It has never been more relevant than it is now.
Moments ago, the ancient stone walls of Buckingham Palace could no longer contain the seismic shift brewing within, as the institution broke its long-held silence with an announcement that has, quite literally, left the entire nation speechless. In a stark, carefully worded statement delivered from a hushed and tense briefing room, royal aides confirmed the fears that had been whispered in the corridors of power and speculated across front pages for months. A date has been set. King Charles III, the sovereign who waited a lifetime to ascend the throne, has made the unprecedented modern decision to choose the moment he will step away from it. The official statement lasted less than 3 minutes, yet its impact was immediate and seismic, creating an atmosphere veteran correspondents described as unlike anything they had witnessed in decades. Eyes darted in stunned disbelief across the room, pens froze mid-sentence, and a collective breathless stillness hung heavy in the air. It was a single devastating line within the palace communique that finally turned rampant whispers into irrevocable reality. His Majesty has reached a final decision regarding the timeline of his abdication. Those 12 words, spoken with deliberate and sobering restraint, sliced through months of speculation, cutting straight to the heart of the monarchy's future. The palace's tone was meticulously ceremonial, yet every person in that room sensed the profound, history-altering weight behind every measured syllable. It felt, as one seasoned observer later confessed, less like a press briefing and more like watching the pages of history turn before our very eyes. This isn't just news, it is the end of an era and the beginning of a constitutional earthquake. This was not a rumor to be debated in editorials or a temporary arrangement for a health crisis. This was final. A tectonic plate of constitutional reality shifting irrevocably beneath their feet. For years, Charles had been portrayed as the quintessential monarch-in-waiting, a man defined by his dutiful endurance, who would cling to the crown he had spent a lifetime preparing to wear. Now the palace itself was formally, coldly acknowledging that the end of his reign was no longer a distant theory for historians to ponder, but a scheduled event for the calendar. As the briefing concluded, a low, urgent hum filled the air, the sound of a world recalibrating. Reporters scrambled from their seats, rushing to file the story of a generation, while photographers, sensing history in the unspoken, zoomed in on every tightened jaw and lowered gaze of the royal aides, trying to decode the profound emotions they were too disciplined to express openly. Some aides were pale as ghosts, others visibly fought back tears, their composure cracking under the weight of the news. One veteran journalist later described the atmosphere as distinctly funereal, as if the very stones of Buckingham Palace were holding their breath. Outside the gilded gates, a crowd had already begun to gather, united not by celebration, but by a shared, stunned disbelief, their silence more powerful than any cheer. Yet behind this calm and calculated announcement, something far more intricate was unfolding. The abdication date itself remained shrouded in official secrecy, but whispers began to swirl almost instantly among the core of senior reporters. They hinted that the chosen day was not arbitrary. It held a profound symbolic weight, connected, some speculated, to moments both deeply personal and historically charged within the annals of the royal family. A date chosen not by a king, but by a son, a father, and a man reckoning with his own legacy. The announcement ignited a firestorm of frantic speculation among historians and royal watchers, who immediately began scouring the calendar, cross-referencing national holidays, coronation anniversaries, and poignant, private family milestones, all in a desperate attempt to predict which singular date had now been irrevocably etched into the pages of royal history. But perhaps the most striking revelation to emerge from the day's chaos was the sheer secrecy of it all. Even the most senior members of the royal family had been informed only mere hours before the public heard the news. Aides close to the matter, speaking in hushed tones off the record, admitted that several prominent royals, including those with direct lines of succession, received the earth-shattering news in hastily arranged somber phone calls earlier that same day. The abruptness of it all sent a shockwave through the upper echelons of the household, stunning even the most seasoned and unflappable courtiers. This was not the institution's usual slow and deliberate royal rollout, managed with painstaking leaks and careful preparation. It was sharp, decisive, and almost uncharacteristically swift. A calculated strike from a monarch traditionally known for his methodical deliberation. In those breathtaking moments, the palace had managed to achieve what it so rarely does. It left both the voracious media and the ancient monarchy itself utterly stunned, grasping for solid ground. The brief confirmation did not merely announce an abdication date, it signaled with deafening clarity that the transition of power had already begun behind the palace's gilded doors. Critical decisions had been forged in the quiet of private rooms, alliances subtly reshaped, and futures mapped out. The statement to the world was not the beginning of the process, but merely the public unveiling of a meticulously orchestrated plan that was, by then, already irrevocably in motion. The royal family, the government, and the nation were suddenly thrust into a new, uncharted reality, no longer grappling with hypotheticals, but with a firm date. The countdown had officially begun. Yet behind that carefully staged and stoic announcement lies a tempest of untold secrets, quiet betrayals, and profound emotional reckonings that collectively pushed King Charles toward this irreversible decision. To understand why he chose this moment, we must step inside the overwhelming weight of the crown he had chased for over 7 decades, only to discover it was far heavier than anyone could have imagined. Behind the ceremonial smiles and dutiful handshakes were sleepless nights filled with private anguish, concerned whispers from his doctors in the corridors of Balmoral and Sandringham, and silent, worried glances exchanged between his family members. Each passing month etched the toll of the role deeper into his face and spirit, until the man who had once dreamed of ruling began to quietly yearn for release. For more than 70 years, Charles stood in the shadow of destiny, his wait for the throne becoming the longest in British history, a lifetime spent in meticulous preparation for a role that remained perpetually just out of reach. Yet when the crown finally rested upon his head, the reality was a stark contrast to the romanticized vision he had nurtured for so long. The heartbreaking briefness of his reign stood in jarring opposition to the decades of anticipation. It was as if the crown, after being so desperately awaited, had arrived only to cruelly remind him of how little time he had left to wear it. What should have been a triumphant, defining era swiftly transformed into a relentless trial that tested his aging body, his weary spirit, and his unwavering resolve. Behind the grandeur and the pageantry, his health began to quietly fray. Private doctors expressed their concerns in hushed tones, palace aides noticed his increasing fatigue after even minor engagements, and close friends observed a man who was increasingly retreating into a pensive silence, the burden of monarchy finally outweighing a lifetime of ambition. There were no dramatic public collapses or televised medical emergencies to signal the change, only a steady, deliberate decline meticulously hidden behind the thick, unwavering walls of royal protocol and dignified silence. Those in his innermost circle began to whisper that the immense, unrelenting strain of the role was cruelly accelerating what the passing years had already begun. The colossal pressure to be ever-present, to personally embody the nation's stability in an increasingly turbulent world, slowly began to outweigh his depleting physical and emotional reserves. Inside the palace, subtle but significant shifts were underway long before the public sensed anything amiss. Key engagements and foundational duties once led personally by Charles were quietly delegated to others. The Prince and Princess of Wales began seamlessly absorbing more prominent, sovereign-level roles, their presence at major state events and international tours increasing with each passing season. It was not announced as official preparation for a transition, but to the astute observers of the royal machine, it was unmistakably a live rehearsal for the future. William and Catherine came to represent continuity and vitality, a new chapter waiting patiently in the wings, even as the king struggled to keep pace with the relentless demands of the crown. Aides, ever discreet, noticed his gradual withdrawal from the minutiae of monarchy. He began leaving more decisions to his most trusted staff, and more frequently declined evening engagements and foreign travel he would once have championed without a second thought. The late-night briefing papers were reviewed with less frequency. His once famously detailed, marginalia-filled involvement in royal affairs began to thin. This was not born of laziness or negligent oversight, but of a weariness that was deep, profound, and utterly unshakable. The quiet, desperate exhaustion of a man who had given his entire life in service, only to find the final stretch of the race was the most grueling of all. It was the silent, dignified retreat of a monarch who was not losing his dedication, but rather preserving what little of himself remained. Those closest to him began to speak in hushed, concerned tones of a monarch who no longer seemed to be looking ahead to the next decade of plans, but inward, into the depths of his own resilience, a king questioning not the legacy he would leave, but the very strength he had left to sustain it. And through it all, an invisible, agonizing battle grew within him, a daily war between the sacred call of duty and the primal instinct for self-preservation. Charles had been raised from the cradle on the unyielding Victorian principle that the crown must always come before the man, but now, for perhaps the first time in his life, the weary man beneath the heavy crown was quietly, desperately questioning that fundamental truth. The monarch who had once represented unwavering, lifelong patience was now trapped in time's cruel paradox. He had waited too long to rule, and now the role itself was draining what precious little remained of his vitality. And while Charles privately grappled with the immense weight of his destiny, the forces swirling around him were already moving, some with loyal devotion, others with barely concealed ambition. It was in the quiet, haunted corridors of Balmoral, amidst the ghosts of monarchs past, that a conversation took place which would ultimately change everything. Princess Anne, ever the pragmatic and steadfast confidant, confronted her brother with a chilling warning from the front lines. She had seen what was coming, not from the cautious reports of doctors or the whispered calculations of courtiers, but from within the family itself. Her words were simple, yet they landed with devastating force. "They're preparing for a throne without you." It wasn't delivered as a threat, but as a stark prophecy from the one person he trusted absolutely. Anne had always been more than just Charles's sister. She was his mirror, his anchor, and the only one brave enough to tell him the truth he already knew in his heart. She was his most trusted ally, a figure of unvarnished pragmatism, fierce loyalty, and a courage that made her unafraid to speak harsh truths that others would soften or bury beneath layers of polite protocol. While the rest of the royal household tiptoed around sensitive matters, Anne possessed the rare and invaluable privilege of being able to pierce directly through the royal facade. Her profound closeness to Charles wasn't born of political necessity or strategic alliance, but had been forged in the unique fire of their shared burden as the two eldest children of a sovereign, witnesses to a lifetime of relentless duty and isolation. It was this deep, unshakable bond that made her words in the Highlands land with such devastating weight. Long before the palace ever issued its formal world-altering statement, Anne, with her hawk-like perception, had begun to detect the faint but undeniable tremors of shifting loyalty within the institution. It wasn't one grand dramatic betrayal, but a series of quiet, coordinated adjustments. Senior courtiers, once unwaveringly focused on Charles's vision, had begun subtly redirecting their attention and their counsel toward William and Catherine. Invitations for future engagements were worded differently. Briefing papers became less inclusive of the king's personal input. The very tone inside the palace's power centers had shifted almost imperceptibly. But Anne, ever observant, noticed it all. She saw the entire structure of the monarchy, like a vast and ancient machine, slowly and silently repositioning itself for a future in which Charles was no longer at its center. When she finally confronted him, her tone carried a heartbreaking mixture of urgency and profound sorrow. She urged him to face what she believed was now inevitable, to act before others, even with the best intentions, forced his hand. "You have to take control of this," she told him, her voice low and steady, "because if you don't, someone else will." It was a warning that the narrative of his reign was slipping from his grasp, and that his final act of power would be to consciously surrender it. It wasn't an attack. It was a desperate plea from a sister who saw the ground shifting beneath her brother's feet. She understood, with a clarity born of a lifetime of service, that the monarchy had always relied on a precarious balance between public image and private control, and right now, that control was slipping quietly, inexorably into other hands. Behind the gilded palace gates, William and Catherine's influence was expanding with remarkable subtlety. Courtiers, those eternal survivors ever attuned to the slightest breeze of shifting power, had begun instinctively aligning themselves with the future. William's briefings with senior aides became longer and more substantive. Catherine's schedule and responsibilities began to mirror those of a queen-in-waiting. Their presence, a symbol of vitality and continuity, began to fill the public and institutional spaces Charles had once dominated. This wasn't treachery, it was the necessary, pragmatic preparation of an institution built on succession. But to Anne's sharp eye, it was glaringly clear that the family and the household were not adjusting for a distant era, but for a transition that was already in motion. She warned Charles about the senior staff who were already playing their own strategic, long-term games. These weren't overt coups but quiet power plays, carefully staged leaks to favor journalists, strategic scheduling that elevated one household over another, and corrosive whispers in the corridors that shaped perception long before any official announcement could. The vast, intricate machinery of succession, once entirely under his authoritative command, was slowly beginning to hum and turn without his direct hand on the gears. Anne's voice that day carried more than just cold political calculation. It carried the raw, emotional weight of a sister who knew her brother was standing at a personal and historical crossroads, watching his agency erode. She pleaded with him not to become a passive spectator, to not let others script the ending of his reign. "If you don't define this moment, Charles," she said, her gaze steady and intense, "it will define you." Her warning wasn't just about the logistics of handing over power, it was about the very soul of his legacy. It was about whether he would be remembered as the king who was gently eased out by a system already moving on, or as the sovereign who, in a final act of profound strength and self-awareness, consciously chose the nation's future over his own title. Her warning was, therefore, more than sisterly concern. It was a strategic and deeply personal intervention from the one person who saw both the man and the monarch, and who understood that his final duty was to command his own exit. It was a spark that raced through the gilded corridors, illuminating the palace's hidden fault lines and the unspoken calculations that define every transition of power. While the world remained fixated on King Charles's every public move, another figure was rising with a quiet, undeniable precision. Prince William, groomed since birth for the future, yet bound by filial loyalty and protocol to his father, now found himself walking a delicate and increasingly narrow line between obedience and destiny. Each public appearance, each carefully worded speech crafted in consultation with his own team of advisors, became less a duty of the heir and more of a conscious rehearsal for the inevitable. Behind the palace's ornate doors, the subtle change was unmistakable. Advisors and courtiers began treating him not as the heir apparent, but as the incoming king, their briefing shifting from consultation to implementation. In the months following Anne's stark private warning to Charles, William's role began to transform with an almost imperceptible yet calculated momentum. His public engagements increased in number and gravitas, taking him across the globe on diplomatic tours, to state visits and to national commemorations that had once been the exclusive domain of the sovereign. Speeches that were once politely observed by the press were now minutely analyzed for their tone, their strategic vision, and their embodiment of leadership. In each of these moments, the monarchy's center of gravity subtly, irrevocably shifted from the reigning sovereign to the one who would follow. For the public, it felt like a seamless and natural continuation of royal duty. But to those within the palace's inner sanctum, it was clear this was a deliberate and accelerated preparation for the throne. Behind the scenes, loyalties, the lifeblood of the institution, began to realign. Senior advisors who had spent decades serving Charles first and foremost, now quietly, efficiently, started redirecting their attention, their expertise, and their counsel toward William. It wasn't an act of betrayal, but a deep-seated institutional instinct for self-preservation, the ancient machinery of the crown ensuring its own continuity by steadily, silently transferring its allegiance to the future. The monarchy, as an ancient institution built to outlive any single individual, had already begun to anticipate its own future with a practiced, unsentimental rhythm, and in William, many of its key players saw not just a successor, but the next essential anchor of stability in an uncertain world. Long-serving courtiers, the guardians of tradition and continuity, instinctively began offering him more detailed briefings, first cautiously deferring to his vision in high-level strategy meetings, and then scheduling his public engagements with an authority that had once belonged exclusively to his father. Their language subtly changed in his presence. Phrases like "when you are king" began to replace the distant "one day," as if the timeline had been internally and universally ratified without ever being officially declared. Through this quiet but profound transition, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, emerged as a powerful and indispensable stabilizing force. Her presence beside William was both reassuring and commanding, a visual signal of unity, continuity, and a new kind of quiet strength. While William grappled privately with the immense weight of the impending crown, Catherine played the crucial role of both strategist and confidant, helping to navigate the delicate and emotionally charged balance between honoring Charles's reign and preparing for their own. Her growing visibility at events of state was not accidental. It was a calculated part of a long-term plan. She embodied the future of the monarchy in a way that resonated deeply with both the public and the palace elite, representing a blend of modern warmth and timeless duty. But this inexorable rise was not without its profound personal tension. William found himself at an emotional crossroads, torn between his desire to support his father fully during a period of visible struggle, and the sobering realization that the very machinery of the institution he was born to lead was preparing for his reign, with increasing urgency and little room for sentiment. He was being pulled forward by the tide of history, even as his heart compelled him to stand steadfastly by his father's side. Late at night, in the hushed and book-lined studies of Kensington Palace, Prince William began holding a series of private, strictly confidential meetings with his most trusted senior staff. These discussions, cloaked in utmost secrecy, now centered not on the hypothetical if, but on the pressing when and how of a transition that felt increasingly imminent. The sessions focused with clinical detail on transition plans, ceremonial adjustments for a new reign, and the intricate, sprawling responsibilities of the crown that would one day and soon be his alone. He was being systematically prepared by the institution, and whether he admitted it to himself or not, he was actively preparing himself, steeling his mind for the burden he was born to carry. Yet beneath the composed and dutiful exterior he presented to the world, the emotional toll was mounting. In the outside world, rumors intensified in the press, fed by calculated leaks and genuine speculation. The whispers grew bolder, shifting from quiet concern for the king's health to open discussion of abdication, often intertwined with glittering popular visions of a youthful monarch and a modernized crown. William knew with a sinking certainty that these conversations were not happening in isolation. They were part of a larger, unstoppable momentum, a tide of history and public expectation that he could neither stop nor openly acknowledge. Every new public engagement, every handshake, every speech delivered with measured calm now carried the silent, colossal weight of a future that was rapidly approaching, a destiny he could no longer postpone. But no royal ascent comes without its shadows, and in the ancient gilded halls of the royal household, shadows often take the form of silent power struggles and secrets long buried. As the palace braced for a change that would redefine it, Queen Camilla found herself caught in a personal storm she never imagined having to weather. The position she had fought for decades to secure, enduring public scorn and private pain to be accepted as Charles's wife and queen consort, now faced a new existential threat, not from scandal, but from the relentless march of time itself. Behind the closed doors of their private residences, she pleaded with Charles to reconsider, her voice laced with a raw fear that her hard-won role, her title, and her fragile legacy would all vanish into obscurity the moment he stepped down, leaving her adrift in a court that would swiftly reorient itself entirely around a new king and queen. For years, Camilla had navigated the treacherous waters of public skepticism, profound private turmoil, and stiff institutional resistance to painstakingly carve out a place for herself beside Charles. She had endured a level of scrutiny and vitriol that would have broken others, slowly, doggedly transforming herself from a controversial figure in a painful public drama into a respected, dutiful, and seemingly indispensable royal consort. But as the once faint whispers of abdication solidified into confirmed plans, the very foundation she had so carefully built over decades began to feel like shifting sand beneath her feet. The title of Queen Consort, a hard-won battle and a symbol of her ultimate acceptance, now seemed destined to fade quietly into history the moment Charles relinquished the throne, leaving her with the ambiguous and far less influential title of Queen Dowager. Her private conversations with Charles grew more emotional and desperate by the day. She begged him to delay, to reconsider, to find the strength to hold on to the crown for just a little longer. For Camilla, the abdication wasn't just the end of his reign, it was the effective end of hers. She viscerally feared being reduced to a mere footnote in a swiftly changing royal narrative, one that would be overwhelmingly dominated by the youthful popularity and modern image of William and Catherine, whose shining appeal cast long eclipsing shadows over her more traditional role. In her most private moments, she admitted to a handful of confidantes that stepping aside now felt like a cruel erasure of her decades-long fight for acceptance, a battle she had only just recently won. These tense exchanges between husband and wife were layered with deep love, but strained by their starkly differing visions of the future. Charles, weathered by the crown and resolute in his duty, believed his decision was a necessary sacrifice for the long-term stability of the monarchy. Camilla, however, saw it not as strategic foresight, but as a premature surrender. She questioned whether the institution she had fought so hard to join would truly protect her legacy once the new chapter began, or whether history would simply push her aside to make uninterrupted room for a new, brighter era. Those close to the couple described nights filled with heated discussions, frustrated tears, and heavy, resigned silences. Within the palace, advisors were sharply split. One camp fully supported Charles's decision, focusing pragmatically on the seamless transfer of power to a popular Prince William. Others, however, whispered concerns about what Camilla's sudden diminishment would mean for royal continuity and public perception, worrying that sidelining the queen consort could appear ungrateful and destabilizing. revealing an institution so focused on its future that it was willing to discard its recent past. The sand continued to shift, and with it, the ground upon which Camilla stood. The palace, a centuries-old engine of continuity, now hummed with the discord of these deep divisions, leading to subtle but bitter infighting as courtiers aligned with competing visions of the future began leaking carefully curated information to journalists in strategically timed whispers. It wasn't long before reports emerged in loyalist newspapers, suggesting a beleaguered Queen Camilla felt profoundly betrayed not just by individuals, but by history itself, as if all the personal sacrifices and decades of dignified public service were being casually overshadowed by a future she had no power to shape. In her quiet, determined way, Camilla began to rally what allies she had left within the ancient institution, reaching out to sympathetic senior figures and subtly pressing for procedural delays or transitional roles that might slow the seemingly inexorable momentum. She hoped to preserve some measure of her hard-won influence, to insert a clause for the queen consort in the new chapter, and to keep the relentless machinery of the monarchy from sweeping her aside entirely. But even her most steadfast allies could see the tide was turning with irreversible force. The transition plans were too advanced, the public narrative of a fresh start under William and Catherine too firmly in motion. Her struggle therefore became less about changing the final outcome and more about a poignant, desperate clinging to relevance in the face of historical inevitability. But Charles's decision had long since ceased to be merely personal. It had evolved into a matter of meticulous national choreography, each step timed with symbolic precision. The moment that would define a generation, the first voluntary abdication of a British monarch in centuries, was now being set in stone behind the palace's velvet curtains. In hushed, somber rooms, senior advisors circled calendars, constitutional historians weighed in on precedent and protocol, and King Charles himself often sat in contemplative silence as one specific date was quietly, finally underlined. It was not chosen at random. This date carried the faint, powerful echoes of the past, perhaps the anniversary of his mother's coronation or the day his own reign began, a whispered significance known only to the innermost circle, intended as a final coded message from a king who understood the weight of legacy better than anyone else. The entire process unfolded with a level of secrecy usually reserved for matters of top-level state security, in private meetings attended by only his most trusted palace advisors, where discussions grew intense over the symbolic resonance, the logistical feasibility, and the ultimate meaning of the day that would end one reign and formally begin the next. It wasn't simply about finding a convenient time on the calendar, it was about consciously crafting history, an act of narrative control unprecedented in the modern monarchy. Every potential date was minutely examined, not just for its logistical feasibility, but for its deep symbolic weight, its ability to speak respectfully to the past while decisively ushering in a new future. This wasn't merely a calendar decision, it was a final, powerful statement to the nation and to posterity. Charles, ever the student of history and deeply conscious of the monarchy's long narrative arc, listened carefully as his most trusted advisors presented options intricately tied to pivotal moments in royal and personal history. Some suggested aligning the abdication with the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II's accession, symbolizing a clean, dutiful passing of the torch from one generation to the next. Others pushed for dates connected to deeply personal milestones in Charles's own life, the birth of a grandchild, the anniversary of his marriage to Camilla, moments that would imbue his departure with an intimate, almost poetic resonance. As the discussions deepened, Charles remained characteristically quiet, a vessel of contemplation, weighing not just the political ramifications but the raw emotion of the moment. In the end, the chosen date emerged not with a bang, but with a quiet, solemn inevitability. Those present in the room described the atmosphere as hushed and reverential, as if everyone understood they were witnessing the marking of a future historical chapter that would be studied for generations. A single, deliberate stroke of a pen on an otherwise ordinary document confirmed it, sealing months of intense private speculation. From that moment on, every action, every plan, would move inexorably toward that single day. It was no longer theoretical. The end of Charles's reign now had a date, a definitive endpoint that initiated a countdown known only to a handful of individuals sworn to absolute secrecy. Preparations began in near total silence, a covert operation within the palace walls. A discreet task force, comprising only the most senior and discreet officials, was formed to handle the intricate choreography of what would be the first voluntary royal abdication of the modern era. In locked rooms, legal teams pored over centuries-old precedents, searching for a constitutional path. Ceremonial planners, with no blueprint to follow, drafted and redrafted outlines for the unprecedented handover, while security units began contingency planning for a global media storm of unimaginable scale. Every department worked under the strictest instructions. Absolute silence, not a whisper, not a hint, was to leave the palace walls until the official announcement. Even as the cold machinery of state accelerated, the emotional weight of the chosen date began to ripple through the innermost circle of the family. Senior royals, who had been deliberately kept in the dark to prevent leaks, were informed one by one in stark private briefings. Their reactions, carefully contained, ranged from a saddened quiet acceptance to barely concealed stunned disbelief, each member grappling privately with the reality that the bedrock of their lives, the eternal nature of the crown, was about to fundamentally and voluntarily change. The chosen date now hung over them all, a point on the horizon toward which they were all now sailing, a moment of both an ending and a beginning that promised to reshape the British monarchy forever. The announcement did not merely signal a change in leadership, it unleashed a torrent of collective introspection, revealing how deeply the monarchy is woven into the personal and national identity. For some within the establishment, it was a relief, a clear, structured path toward a necessary transition. For others, it was a sharp, unsettling reminder that the era they had known and built their lives upon was drawing to an irrevocable close. This reality hit hardest in private, behind the closed doors of royal residences, where individual titles, household roles, and personal futures were suddenly and quietly reconsidered in the wake of a single seismic decision. As the world awoke to learn the date, the palace's final, carefully crafted statement reached the public, and Britain seemed to stand still. Newspapers blared historic headlines, phones buzzed incessantly with notifications, and the very air felt charged with the electricity of a permanent shift. For millions, Charles had been a constant through turbulent decades, a figure evolving from a young prince to a silver-haired king. Now his abrupt departure felt like losing a familiar chapter of their own lives. Tears mixed with shock, and even his most vocal critics found themselves whispering in disbelief, "It's really happening." Across the United Kingdom and throughout the Commonwealth, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Spontaneous, somber crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, not in protest or wild celebration, but in a state of quiet, collective disbelief. Strangers spoke to one another in hushed, respectful tones, united by the weight of a shared moment in history. Elderly citizens who had witnessed his entire journey from a shy heir to a reigning monarch wiped away tears, while younger generations scrolled through their phones, trying to comprehend the magnitude of the news unfolding on their screens. The emotional outpouring was unlike anything seen in decades. Messages flooded social media, newspapers rushed out special editions, and broadcasters suspended regular programming to dissect every nuanced line of the palace's communique. The media machine shifted into overdrive. Pundits and analysts debated what the abdication meant for the monarchy's future. Political commentators parsed every phrase for hidden significance, and historians were brought onto live broadcasts to provide context for an event with no modern precedent. The statement's language, so restrained yet so final, became a subject of intense global scrutiny. This wasn't just news, it was history unfolding in real time, sentence by sentence. From Downing Street to the devolved governments, political figures offered carefully measured responses, crafted to strike a delicate balance between honoring Charles's lifetime of service and embracing the new chapter under William. There was no room for diplomatic missteps. Beyond Britain, messages of support and reflection poured in from world leaders and foreign monarchies, underscoring the international significance of the event. Allies framed the abdication as a testament to Charles's self-awareness and dedication to the institution's stability. Amid this global reaction, a profound wave of nostalgia swept the nation. Broadcasts revisited archival footage of Charles's earliest public appearances, his decades of work as Prince of Wales, and the milestones of his short but impactful reign. It became an emotional reckoning for millions, a reminder of the relentless passage of time and the end of an era they had grown up with. Yet, while the public processed the news inside the palace walls, the machinery of transition was accelerating at a frenetic pace. As the abdication date loomed, every corner of the institution became a stage for the most intricately choreographed handover in modern history. Behind gilded doors, dress rehearsals for the accession ceremony were conducted, legal documents were prepared for signature, and midnight briefings unfolded under a cloak of utmost secrecy. The palace was no longer just a symbol of power, it was the engine room of a voluntary revolution, meticulously planning every second of the day when the crown would pass, not by the call of death, but by the quiet, determined will of the king himself. Every step was planned with regal precision, every public emotion carefully restrained, yet beneath the impeccable facade, a simple human truth echoed through the marbled halls. A son was about to inherit a throne, and a father was about to say goodbye. In these final days, the palace transformed into a living machine of preparation. Legal teams, operating in hushed urgency, finalized centuries-old procedures adapted for a modern world, scrutinizing documents line by line to ensure the constitutional transfer of power would occur without a single misstep. Beyond the paperwork, a delicate coordination unfolded across the institutions forming the monarchy's backbone. The church prepared to bless the transition, Parliament received quiet briefings to ensure political alignment, and military officials rehearsed ceremonial displays with flawless discipline. Meanwhile, William faced his own private rehearsals behind closed doors, practicing the weighty oaths and gestures until they became second nature, his calm exterior belying the undeniable gravity of ceasing to be the heir and becoming the sovereign. For Charles, these days were marked by quiet reflection and conversations filled with gratitude, and the solemn awareness of a chapter closing far sooner than anyone had expected. Camilla, her position growing increasingly fragile, watched from the periphery as the influence she had fought so hard to build faded in real time, a painful reminder that power within the monarchy is inseparable from the crown itself. Through it all, Princess Anne remained the family's steady anchor, her unwavering presence ensuring that personal emotion did not disrupt the historical imperative. And then, the day arrived. As the world watched, King Charles walked one last time through the palace corridors as sovereign, the air crackling with a solemn electricity. The ceremony unfolded with meticulous grace, the signing of the abdication document, the reading of the proclamation culminating not in fanfare, but in a profound collective stillness. William and Catherine stood beside him, embodying the confidence of the future, while Camilla's quiet, tearful reaction revealed the deeply personal cost of the day. As the final words were spoken, the crowd's applause was tinged not with jubilation, but with respect and gratitude for a monarch who had chosen to define his own ending, gifting the throne to the future in a deliberate act that was less a retreat and more a final profound service. The crown now prepares to rest on a new head, the echoes of a bittersweet chapter lingering as a new era dawns. Thanks for watching this deep dive into a moment that would redefine a monarchy. What did you think of this portrayal of a modern abdication? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you were captivated by this historical turning point, please show your support by liking this video, sharing it with other history enthusiasts, and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss our next exploration. Click the next video on your screen now to continue the journey. We'll see you in the next one.